Today we're going to talk about the last and final consideration, establishing a budget and timeline. What are all the different costs that go into your project implementation? Your software licensing, the cost of your system implementer, any backfill requirements that you might need. Does it make sense to do a phased approach instead of a big bang? What's the best route to mitigate risk? And then how does all of that affect the budget if you're phasing over 4 years now as opposed to doing, a big bang over 1.5 years, for example? Do you have critical company events or competing projects that need to be taken into account? So those are just some of the questions that you need to ask yourself as you start establishing a budget and timeline. So to talk a little bit more about this consideration, I'm going to pass it over to Tom Petruccione.
Thanks, Zubin. All right, so thanks for the setup, Zubin. We're going to talk about budget and timeline here, of course. And let's start with the budget piece. And this budgeting piece is going to start with a little bit of a different flavor coming from a ground to cloud type scenario. So you're used to the hosting costs, you're used to potentially third-party hosting costs. That's going to be different when you jump into the cloud. And really the thing you need to consider is cloud subscriptions. You need to consider support and implementation costs as part of the budgeting for this transformation to the cloud. The other thing you may want to keep in mind is, does your SI need to do some additional support once the project is live? So typically us at Alithya will have a hypercare period where our consultants would stay on board for to support the project for 30 days to 90 days. But is there a managed services need post-project to support the software as well? But those are all considerations that you need to make when you're taking a look at the budget. The other piece you need to think about now is capital expenses versus operating expenses model. So in the old world, you were doing a lot of CapEx because you were buying hardware, you were hosting the software. Now you can talk about operating expenses where this is a subscription, a monthly subscription, an ongoing subscription. So there are tax ramifications from flipping from that capital expenses to operating expenses model. So that's something you need to consider as well. Also need to consider budgeting for a phased approach. So get operational and then expand. We see a lot of organizations that we work with that may get some core modules on board first and then expanding the footprint once you get comfortable. Zubin mentioned it in the intro. You need to consider from a risk perspective what makes the most sense for your organization. So the budget might not be for a big bang approach for all modules. It might be get some base modules in and then expand your footprint as you move forward from year to year. And then the final piece is consider multi-pillar projects. So ERP and HCM, of course, we know there's dependencies across there, across those modules from a cost allocation flex field, costing, as well as other dependencies. That's also going to reduce resource costs. So let's say you have a project manager that is managing that multi-pillar project. You can have some potential cost savings there instead of having that PM extending out further. So things to consider when you're building out the budget. We at Alithya can also help with this process, coming on board and assisting with building out a budget for the project. But those are things that you definitely need to consider when you're budgeting for this ground to cloud transformation. The second piece we're going to talk through here on this slide is going to be the timeline. So things to consider, the budget is a big piece, of course, but also priorities within the organization, initiatives, pain points, other projects within the organization, keeping in mind that there might be competing resources for these various initiatives within the organization. So you got to keep that in mind as you're building out the timeline for this ground to cloud transformation. Also consider key dates to develop the timeline. What does your HR calendar look like? When is open enrollment? Fiscal year from an ERP perspective. Payroll year begin is always a good place to start from a go live perspective. When is your compensation cycle? All these things that you need to consider when you're taking a look at your timeline for your project and key dates within your organization across those multi-pillars. Then the final piece is consider resource conflicts, operational readiness, and module alignment. We talked in previous modules about your operational readiness, talk about module alignment across the organization and any resource conflicts that you might have as well. So do you have the bandwidth to be able to address this project in a certain timeline, maybe a year year end or year begin are factors in this process. So all things that you need to consider when you're building out the timeline for the project. Zubin?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, really great insight. On the surface, considering your budget and timeline are probably seem obvious, when you go into an implementation project, but you did a good job of explaining, there are many variables and factors that go into evaluating this, and all of them should be taken into account when companies are planning their implementation. Thank you for watching our webinar on the top 5 considerations that companies should make sure they're thinking about when embarking on their Oracle Cloud implementation journey. We talked about identifying business objectives, evaluating your current system and infrastructure, aligning your business teams internally, assessing your team's skills and operational readiness, and finally establishing a clear budget and timeline. We hope this has been helpful for you, and we hope that you feel much more prepared for success when embarking on your ground to cloud journey.